Robert Strand. Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Strand, and it is my privilege to be with you. I'm coming to you from here at the great University of California, Berkeley, where I have had the privilege for the last 9 years to be on the faculty and the executive director of the Center for Responsible Business, and as of the last 2 years, the executive director of the Nordic Center at UC Berkeley. So I'm thrilled that you are gathering to discuss, of course, the Nordics and the importance of the Nordics in the world. And we are here at the University of California, Berkeley as your partner in these explorations. And as a faculty member, I have the privilege to teach a suite of courses at the undergraduate and MBA and executive MBA levels. And they're all titled the same thing: Sustainable Capitalism in the Nordics? Question mark. And that question mark does a lot of heavy lifting as we consider topics of sustainable capitalism and questions: is capitalism sustainable? And if not, how do we make it so? And as the title of these courses, as the fact that we've worked to launch the Nordic Center could indicate to you, I'm of the very firm belief that the Nordics it's not the answer, but they present the promise for us to achieve sustainable development. And I'm drawing from the former Prime Minister of Norway when I talk about sustainable development, Gro Harlem Brundtland, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That's the objective. That's the objective that we have. Now, I'm going to share a few offerings from my humble perspective here, being an American who's taken such an interest in the Nordic region, has lived and worked and studied in the Nordic countries for several years, first as a Fulbright scholar to Norway many years ago, about 20 years ago, and then as a PhD student in Copenhagen at the Copenhagen Business School, and staying on as a professor in sustainability at the Copenhagen Business School. I'm going to draw a bit from, you see this piece of paper here, it is my unpublished manuscript for this book that I've been working on for the last, my youngest son Jonas is 7, and I started it when he was born, so about 7 years. And the title of this book is called Nordic Capitalism: Lessons for Realizing Sustainable Capitalism. A former title was Sustainable Vikings, and I have a MOOC and developed several offerings underneath that moniker, which I like. It's got a good branding to it. But as I've increasingly engaged throughout the United States, this idea of capitalism and how to make capitalism sustainable is something that draws a lot of really important attention here. So that's what I'd like to offer, just a few things, just what I find interesting about the Nordics. And with respect to capitalism, well, it's a very different variety of capitalism that's been developed in the Nordic region than what we've experienced here in the United States. And this is where I'm based primarily at a business school here in the US, the Haas School of Business. And I think that it's very important for business schools to increasingly encourage discussions about what is this thing called capitalism, and an acknowledgement with humility that American capitalism is but one variety of capitalism. There are capitalisms in this world. And that was something that I didn't fully grasp until I had the opportunity to live and work in the Nordic region, which by all definitions of capitalism is capitalism. A tendency for private ownership of property, a tendency for the private sector to employ the labor, a tendency for markets to set the prices for goods, services, and labor, the wages, and a tendency for markets to also set the quantities of the goods and the services and how many people are employed. A tendency there. And the Nordics and the United States, well, these contexts, they all satisfy that. These are primarily market-driven economies. They're capitalism. But where I would argue is a fundamental difference between the Nordic approach, and out of convenience, I'll call it Nordic capitalism, recognizing that there are differences within the countries. But when we compare the Nordic nations to the United States, the Nordics are much more similar than they are different. And some of these commonalities are that I've seen a more pragmatic approach to markets and a more pragmatic approach to private ownership of property to say, let's use these concepts where they work well. But we're not ideologically married to markets. If it's not working well, we'll figure out something else. I've seen that pragmatic approach in the Nordic region that I haven't seen in the United States. And we could say things like access to health care, or access to childcare, access to paid parental leaves. These sort of things that have been set up, established as part of a universal offering in the Nordic region, outside the domain of the markets. We see in the United States, when these things are market-driven, kids having access to childcare, well, poor kids don't get access, or access to health care. We have 4 million children in the United States that don't have access to health care. And that's not just an ethical failing on a monumental level, but it's also very inefficient. It's very inefficient for people not to have access to quality health care. It's very inefficient for our kids not to have access to child care. It's actually a drag on the economy. People pull out of the workforce, and predominantly women pulling out of the workforce to care give in the US setting, that drags on our productivity. Now, these are some of the arguments that I pose in the United States, and that I can point to the Nordics to say, I know there's a different approach. I know there's a different way. And fundamentally then, what do I see in the Nordic context that how this all works so comparatively well? And I emphasize comparatively well because Nordic region, you got problems. And oftentimes it's folks from the Nordics who are the first to tell me that when I'm running around talking about how I think the United States should learn from the Nordics. It's this self-criticism that I sense from a Nordic audience that actually I trust folks in the Nordics more because of that self-criticism. And while recognizing that there's great room for improvements, the fact that you in the Nordic region, on the whole, on average, spend about 10, 11% of your GDP on healthcare, versus in a US context, we spend roughly 17, 18% of our GDP on healthcare. And oh, by the way, 4 million children without access, et cetera, and we're not getting better outcomes. You can start to say there are inefficiencies here in the US variety of capitalism. And that is how I can package it in the US to help draw attention to the Nordic region. And underpinning all this is the Nordic, a comparatively really well-functioning democracies. So as I talk about this idea of, is capitalism sustainable? And if we're trying to construct a variety of capitalism in the world that could be sustainable, Nordics, you're not there yet. You've more or less satisfied that first half of the Brundtland definition of sustainable development. Development that meets the needs of the present. You're doing a pretty damn good job of that. However, you're not meeting that second half without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. But I have great hope that you will achieve the full definition of sustainable development, and it's fundamentally because your democracies work really well. And so what we need to achieve such a thing as sustainable capitalism, we need to get good policies in place so that those markets that are setting the prices and the quantities of goods, services, and labor in society are actually rewarding the good actors and punishing the bad. And to do that, you need to internalize negative externalities. And to do that, you need to have powerful actors in society like fossil fuel industry, like other industries that are heavy carbon emitters, to actually support very smart policies to internalize those negative externalities. And for too long, we've seen the vested powers in the US context use their power to cut my taxes. You look at many of our largest corporations pay $0 in federal taxes in the United States. And I hear a different conversation in the Nordic region. I hear a conversation about paying a fair share of taxes, a responsible level of taxation, and where folks leverage taxes as a tool for policy to drive sustainability, to drive things like adoption of electric vehicles, for example, in Norway that we see. Incentivize through taxation and get the tax policies right. Okay, a few other things that I see in a Nordic context, and that is this ability to cooperate. So this consensus building culture of the Nordic region, which is fundamentally a very important attribute for well-functioning democracies. And here I look at the individual level Nordic leadership. And our students are very turned on to working in organizations where this brand of leadership, a consensus building, a sort of flatter, where the boss doesn't have all the answers but asks questions and creates space for folks to bring their good ideas. It's a desirable sort of organization that our students want to work with. I think this is a real advantage that Nordic-based firms have, and that is the potential to attract the best talent in the world. And people know about the Nordics, but I'd say you're kind of a well-kept secret in this respect. And when I have the privilege of these great students coming into my office and talking about their potential future careers and what kind of organizations they'd like to join, I can't help but think in my mind, oh, you want to work for the typical Nordic company. You want work-life balance. You want a company that's committed to sustainability principles. You want to have a voice. You want to work with a typical company from the Nordic region. And that word is slowly getting out. And this is also part of our efforts here with the Nordic Center at UC Berkeley, is to be a great friend and ally for Nordic-based companies that do business here in the States and also the Nordics and elsewhere in the world. We want to just build a pipeline from our wonderful talent here at the great University of California, Berkeley, with your organizations. That's another thing that we look at. Then also at the organizational level, I see the Nordic region as being able to usher in a new era of corporate strategy. An era of corporate strategy where the focus is on cooperation and achieving a cooperative advantage versus what the narrative's been since Michael Porter wrote his 5 Forces article. It's been all about achieving competitive advantage. And I would argue that actually it's your ability to cooperate and bring stakeholders together around big issues, like those represented by the Sustainable Development Goals. This is actually your cooperative advantage. This is your competitive advantage. Your ability to cooperate is actually your competitive advantage. And I fear at times when I go around and look at bookshelves within the universities across the Nordic region that there are too many American management books on your shelves. Because I actually think that, almost ironically, it is if you want to achieve a competitive advantage, you got to cooperate, and an outcome will be competitive advantage. If you focus on saying, I want to compete and beat the hell out of everyone else, that actually prevents you from being able to cooperate and be a good partner. And the final thing that I'll say then, as the sun moves around here, this is one wonderful thing about the University of California, Berkeley, is you always see that bright ball up in the sky. So I'm working with a little shadow as the sun starts to go down here, and I would be that wonderful tower that you see behind me. Actually, that's a real symbol of the Nordics here on campus. That's the Peter Sather Tower. Peter Sather is a Norwegian born. He's a co-founder of the great University of California, Berkeley. Our Nordic roots run deep here. The Nordic roots run very deep here at the University of California, Berkeley. So what I see as an opportunity for the Nordic region is leveraging the successes, the comparative successes that you've had thus far to meet that first half of the Brundtland definition of sustainable development. Development that meets the needs of the present. And leveraging your strong and robust democracies that can present the promise for us to establish the policies that we need to achieve full-on sustainable development, achieve that second half without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That means we have to live within our planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries, of course, another Nordic concept born out of the Stockholm Resilience Center, and looking at the world as a system. And we're operating it at above its capacity. We are drawing more from the Earth each year than what the Earth can replenish, including the Nordics. You're not as bad as us Americans, but you're bad because we're all over consuming. And this is a developed nation problem that we have, all the OECD countries. The Nordics will present the promise for us to get the policies in place to lead the world and show that you can have vibrant economies, a vibrant society, and live within planetary boundaries. And that is my humble hope for you good folks in the Nordics, is to recognize you are in a position of global leadership. Whether you like it or not, you are. And now we need you to succeed. We need the Nordics to succeed. And this is where we at the Nordic Center at the University of California, Berkeley, we intend to shine a bright global spotlight on you folks in the Nordics, recognizing the world needs leadership. The world needs a good example, and you can provide it. So I would appeal not only to your sense of opportunity in the Nordic region, but I'd also appeal to your sense of duty, your sense of responsibility in this world. That will require you to take some bold steps. That will require you to move faster before we necessarily have the firm, definitive answers, and to establish policies and practices that truly live within planetary boundaries, that truly meet the full definition of sustainable development. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that's a question that I would leave you with. And that is, what action and actions will you take, Nordic region, to make a conspicuous showing on the global stage that you are stepping up and assuming your rightful role as global leaders to usher in a new era of sustainable development, of sustainable capitalism. We need you. I believe in you. I think that you're going to help lead us to the era where our future generations, our kids, my little Mikkel and Jonas, their children, and all of our collective children thereafter, where we've got a world that is living within the planetary boundaries, that is just, that is inclusive, that has strong democratic institutions, that can weather some storms, political storms throughout. Nordics, I believe in you. And I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to have a conversation with you here virtually at the great University of California, Berkeley. And I look forward to having the opportunity to meet you in person in the future and hearing what comes from your important conversations that you're having there. So with that, Robert Strand from the University of California, Berkeley, the Center for Responsible Business, and the Nordic Center here, I wish you a good rest of your day and onward.